Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. Update 39 is just about here. It will be available August 21st on PC and September 5th on console. As far as updates go, I'd say this one definitely doesn't shake things up nearly as much as some patches we've had in the past. And while there are some really important things to note, fundamentally, the way that the game is played is not really going to change too much for most people. There are quite a few quality of life improvements, a handful of balance changes, and a ton of bug fixes, so I'll go through the ones that I think are important for you to be aware of to continue to get the most out of your character going into Update 39. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about quality of life. The first big one here is quest and content improvements for new players. So I won't go through each of these individually, but essentially what they're doing is staggering out a lot of the quests that the new players have typically been bombarded with at the start of their ESO experience. This can be a bit overwhelming, and while choice is great, too much choice can just lead to confusion. So it seems like they're putting some level limits as well as some quest completion requirements for some of these before they will unlock and be available for the player. They're also updating event tickets so you can't accidentally lose them when you are at the cap. I still think the cap is a bit arbitrary and not really super consumer friendly, but that is for a different discussion. At least now, what would have been wasted tickets in the past will now be a warning that you are at the limit, so you can go spend them and then return to the activity to pick up the new ones. We're also getting some new monster masks for Cyrodiil, Gerald Mountain's Warchief, Nibene Bay Battle Reeve, and Colovian Highlands General. They added some monster masks for Imperial City not too far back, and those were the first ones obtainable outside of dungeons. So now we have a few more options here, and these will be purchasable from Cyrodiil's Elite Gear Vendor in 3 new containers for 50k AP each, and there are also style pages which can be purchased from the War Researcher Vendor as individual pages for 150k AP each. The bonuses on these are all PvP themed, and they do seem like they could be pretty nice there for sure for some builds. They aren't really relevant for PvE content though, as those bonuses are either player specific or involve mechanics that aren't really dealt with in PvE. They've also added some new face and body markings that can be purchased with AP and gladiator proofs. Next up, we have the Scamps in Imperial City. These are being updated. They won't appear quite as frequently, but they will offer better rewards, including a bunch of Telvar on the Cunning Scamps, and Imperial City gear sets will drop from the Trove Scamps. They've also updated the achievements for killing these to require way less kills than before. This was one of the more complained about achievements in the game, so this should be way more reasonable at only 10 kills needed of each instead of 100. They've also updated a number of the other annoyingly grindy achievements, as well as added in some new achievements for various activities like completing mythics and leveling different classes. Next up, we have some updates to item set sourcing. So they've gone through Cyrodiil, the Craglorn Trials, Hughesbane, and Gold Coast, and tweaked some of the ways that we obtain certain item sets. So in Cyrodiil, the rewards for the Worthy Males will have the newest PvP item sets, but the older ones are going to be removed and added to the other Cyrodiil gear sources. Looks like they're also moving to have all of the light, medium, and heavy available by the town merchants now, instead of having it split between Bruma, Cropsford, and Vlasteros. So a little bit easier to go buy the gear that you want now. For the Craglorn Trials, these have been bugged since curation started, as they work a little bit differently from normal instance content with the way that the gear drops from them. And this has led to certain sets not being curated properly. So instead of Infallible Mage, Vicious Serpent, and Eternal Warrior having a chance to drop from all 3 of these trials, they've split them up thematically, with Infallible Mage dropping in Aetherian Archive, Vicious Serpent being placed in Sanctum Ophidia, and Eternal Warrior will now drop solely from Helroth Citadel. This should fix the curation problems if you want to get a group together to finish up your sticker books for some of those Craglorn trial sets. And then finally, Hughesbane and Gold Coast, they had some sets that were a little strange in that they dropped in multiple weights, light, medium, and heavy, and the sources of getting these were very limited. So now they've opened it up across these zones for the various activities to drop these sets in all the weights now, so that should drastically bring down the prices on some of those pieces that were pretty hard to come by. All right, the next thing up is unifying unsellable items. This is another really nice change, and one I think may be generally a bit overlooked with how good this will be for new players. So the big thing here is that it will be a lot more consistent and clear as to what you can and cannot sell. But the really big one here for me is actually that first bullet point there. Weapons and armor picked up directly from clickable items throughout the environment. These are now going to be able to be sold for 1 gold each instead of 0. Now, this may sound like it's not a big deal for veterans. You guys have plenty of gold. This won't really matter matter there. But for a new player, I know I'm not the only loot goblin out there, and when I play a game, I like to pick up everything I can and sell it, anything that's not bolted down. So I know for a lot of people, it's really disappointing to start the game and start picking up all this gear only to find out that it's actually not worth anything at all. So I think this is going to be one of those subtle changes that actually greatly improves the feeling of exploration and looting for a new player. Yeah, they're just 1 gold each, but that's still something that is adding up and lets you feel like you're actually adding some value to your character when you click and loot all the items around you. Next up, as with most updates, we are getting a bunch of new furnishings, as well as a new feature that allows you to place furnishings directly from your inventory and from the collection screen. So this is a pretty nice quality of life thing here to not have to dig through as many menus when you already know exactly where the item is that you want to place. Alright, I don't know about y'all, but I've always found it to be pretty annoying that whenever I pull out my merchant or my banker, it gets rid of my companion, and half the time when I put the merchant or banker away, I forget to resummon them. So they've changed it to where the companion will automatically resummon whenever you put away your assistant. And there are a few other changes as well, like the antiquity line is now going to be purchasable in the Crown Store, and PTS template characters will now be able to unlock the Mora's Whispers book requirement. But as far as quality of life stuff goes, I think that covers most of the main ones there. So now we'll move on to the combat and balance changes. So the first one here is pretty big. Bonuses that increase your damage done to monsters will now also apply their effects to proc-based damage. So anytime the game says monsters here, it is actually referring to non-player enemies. I really prefer the Basai tooltip here. It actually lists it as non-player enemies, and I think this is easier to understand what you're getting from it, especially for a newer player. But yeah, monsters just means PvE enemies, if anyone was not aware of that. But this change here in particular is going to be a nice little damage boost for a lot of setups that are using proc sets. So previously this was really inconsistent in that minor and major slayer would boost your proc sets, and these are listed as damage done to monsters. However, sets like Ansul and Valathi would not boost your proc set damage. So they've just gone under the hood here and made it a bit more consistent to allow these percent boosts to monsters to now work on all of your damage. So even slight buffs aside, I think this is just a nice change for the sake of consistency. So this next change here, I really don't like. You can no longer use the in-game menu to leave an instance if you are currently in combat. So I think this was done to limit some exploiting in some rare cases where people would avoid death by porting out of an instance right before it happened, thus leaving the full vitality of the run intact. I do agree that this shouldn't be able to happen, but I think a much better solution would be to just cause the group to lose vitality if anyone uses this feature to port out of an instance. Most of the time when you're using it, you're doing so to leave and reset anyways, or you're simply done with the trial. However, because of ESO having that feature where you're frequently stuck in combat, I already foresee this to be a rather annoying thing for many different scenarios. And even outside of that, you have to wait for your group to completely wipe now to port out of the instance in other scenarios. Just doesn't seem like the best way to handle this at all. And once again, to resolve an issue for a very, very tiny percent of players, they've impacted the quality of life for a large number of players. So I hope that they can revisit this and find a better solution down the road. We did get some class changes as well, starting off with the Dragonknight. The Combustion passive reduced the damage bonus this passive provides to burning and poison status effects to 33%, down from 50%. The developer comment here says, Dragonknights are currently a bit ahead of many other classes in damage production. To address this, we're easing some of their passive power to reel them slightly back to the other classes without stirring the pot too drastically. So this is like 2 or 3 patches too late, in my opinion. I see this fairly often with patch note changes, and sometimes it just seems like ZOS is a little behind on the current landscape of things when some of these nerfs and buffs are introduced. If this was like 6 months or a year ago, I would say, yeah, that's pretty fair, I agree. However, in the current meta, Dragonknights have already been dethroned, and this is only going to make them a less desirable option. ZOS has been doing a pretty good job of buffing up the other classes the past year or so, and I'd like to see them continue in that direction instead. But yeah, overall, it's not a huge deal, you know, going from 150% damage with the poisoned and burning to 133%. It's not the end of the world, but still feels a bit unnecessary given the timing of it. Next up, Green Dragonblood. This morph now adds a small heal over time, lasting 5 seconds and scaling off your max health. So this skill was definitely in a weird place before, as even for tanks, coagulating was usually the best option outside of a few scenarios. So I'm not sure if this is enough to change that, but I think the heal over time would be a welcome addition to it. So let me know what you all think about this one, and if you do some DK tanking, let me know if you'll be swapping from coagulating to Green Dragonblood. For the Necromancers, their Colossus got a really nice buff. They reduced the cost of the ultimate and its morphs to 175 down from 225, and they also increased the damage per hit of all the versions by approximately 11%. So the Pestilent Colossus morph, this morph now always guarantees the disease status effect on each hit. So disease puts a healing debuff on the targets. So definitely looks like the more PvP focused morph. And then Glacial Colossus, this morph now also extends the duration of major vulnerability to 17 seconds per hit, up from 12. So that morph will be 20 seconds of major vulnerability per Colossus if you get all 3 hits on the target. So pretty nice buff here for Necros. They'll be able to crank those out a little bit quicker and have a nice long debuff provided. They also adjusted the Deaden Pain morph of Bitter Harvest. This morph now also increases the duration of the effects it grants to 4 seconds per corpse consumed, up from 2. I'm not sure how enticing this will be compared to the extra ult from the Necrotic Potency morph. It seems like a little bit of a strange way to get major protection. I'm not sure. I don't have a ton of experience necro tanking, so let me know what you all think about this one as well. So next up we have the Nightblade Grim Focus. This ability and its morphs no longer need to be activated to generate stacks, as they will now generate stacks anytime you meet their original requirements simply with the ability slotted on either bar. So this is such a good change. We'll see something similar with Sorcerers here in just a little bit. But essentially you'll no longer need to have that dead cast to keep this up. You just slot it and you're good to go to use it. They also buffed up the Relentless Focus morph, so that will get 400 extra weapon and spell damage at the 5 stacks now instead of 300. And the Merciless Resolve morph will have a higher tooltip on the spectral bow that you fire off. So both of these should be really great options. One costs magicka, one costs stamina, and I think whichever suits your sustain needs better is probably fine to go with. They also changed Shadow Cloak. This ability and the Shadowy Disguise morph now also grant major savagery and prophecy for slotting on either bar to help them offer more functionality outside of PvP and to ensure the abilities still offer something when they are being countered. Dark Cloak, this morph now swaps the major savagery and prophecy to minor protection for slotting on either bar rather than granting it for 10 seconds after casting the ability. So pretty nice quality of life there with this skill as well. I could definitely see this backbarred for some setups to provide that buff on both of your bars and maybe free up some of your potions to get different desired effects. For Surprise Attack, reduce the cooldown of the guaranteed critical strike on this morph to 3 seconds, down from 4. So a little buff there for Surprise Attack. You'll get those guaranteed crits a little bit more often. And then the other morph, Concealed Weapon, this now grants Major Berserk for 10 seconds rather than a unique 10% damage done buff. So I'll be honest, my personal opinion is that I think they just need to scrap the whole damage done bonus with Concealed Weapon. It really isn't being used the way I think they originally intended. Often you're just using this spammable once every 10 seconds to keep up a buff, which I think feels a little bit strange for this type of a skill. Personally, I think they should just add something different that ties in more with its actual spammable function and maybe move some of that passive power elsewhere in the Nightblade's kit where it's a little bit easier to passively access. All right, next up we have the Sorcerer. So Bound Armor will get the same treatment that the Nightblade's Grim Focus did, where the bonus is active on both of your bars. So the Bound Aegis morph now passively grants their minor protection and that 8% max magicka boost for both of your bars whenever you have it slotted on either bar. And then Bound Armaments, this morph will no longer need to be activated to be eligible to generate bound weapons and will instead generate a bound weapon whenever you light or heavy attack with the ability slotted on either bar. And then again, the same thing with that 8% stamina bonus on this morph that will be active on both bars as well. So I really like the direction that they're going with these skills. Just nice and easy to use and makes for some easier to manage setups that use some of their back bar slots for passive damage or survival boosts. For the weapon abilities, we have the bow passive long shots. This will now increase your damage done by 5% against enemies within 15 meters of you, and it'll increase your crit chance by 6% against enemies that are further than 15 meters from you. And this used to be, it increased your damage done with bow attacks by 12% based on how far away you are. So I actually did a video breaking down this change specifically and showcased some builds that are using bows. Definitely recommend checking that out if you are interested in the bow playstyle and you want to dig a little bit deeper into this change, it's linked in the description below, but this is a really nice buff for bows. For the Destruction Staff, Ancient Knowledge, Inferno Staves now increase your damage done with damage over time and status effects by 12%, and Lightning Staves now increase your damage done with direct damage and channeled effects by 12%. So I also did a video breaking down these changes a bit further if you want to check that one out. Overall, I do wish the passives could double dip. For example, with Inferno Staves, if you have the Burning status effect, this is a dot and a status effect, but it only gets boosted by 12% with the Inferno Staff, not 24%. So even with Inferno Staff now being the quote-unquote status effect weapon, generally your status effects will still hit harder with dual wield stats. So while I don't necessarily hate the changes here, I don't really know what they accomplish either. Next up is the Penetrating Magic passive. This now causes your Destruction Staff attacks to ignore 2974 spell resistance rather than 10% of the target's spell resistance. So a nice little buff for sure for staves, especially if you're using the Force Shock or Impulse skills in that line as spammables. Next up, Trifocus Flame Staff. This passive now applies a damage over time equal to power of a standard damage over time effect over 20 seconds with a fully charged heavy attack, rather than increasing the damage done of your fully charged heavy attacks by 12%. So this one is a little weird as it just keeps resetting if you're doing a heavy attack build and doesn't really add in much damage overall. I guess for a standard light attack build, you could lead into combat with a heavy attack to trigger this or try to keep it up every 20 seconds, but I don't know. Again, with this one, I'm not really sure what this is accomplishing by adding this in here. And then for the Ice Staff, increase the damage shield granted by this passive to 33% of your max health, up from 25%. So nice little buff there. And then for the Lightning Staff, this passive now only triggers on fully charged heavy attacks rather than any tick of a heavy attack. So definitely a decent sized nerf there for the AoE potential of lightning heavy attack builds. So with all of these changes going on with update 39, these really popular Oaken Soul heavy builds are actually up a little bit in single target damage. Looking at some of these Sorc builds, it's definitely possible to get to 100k on the dummy with those again, but the AoE from the Trifocus passive was essentially cut in half, since you previously got 3 ticks from that, and the last tick was worth about the same value as the first 2 combined. Well, now since you only get that last tick, it's roughly cut in half there. So what does this mean for the setups? Well, I think this definitely pushes the user to try to also slot an AoE spammable if you are doing a heavy attack build and you're going the AoE damage route as your main priority, whereas for single target, you should be good to go with the builds we've already been seeing and see a little bit of a damage increase without really having to change anything up. For the dual wield passive, Twin Blade and Blunt, they reduced the bonuses on this passive to ensure that it is in line with other adjustments being made to weapon passives. So maces will now offer 1487 offensive penetration per mace, swords will give you 129 weapon and spell damage per sword, and daggers will now grant 657 crit chance per dagger, down from 812. So it's about a 0.7% crit chance nerf per dagger. So if you are using 2 daggers, you'll have about 1.4% less crit chance next patch. Not really the end of the world, but I'm also not really sure why they nerfed all the other stats across the board, other than they wanted them to be equal with our typical set bonuses we have. So if you notice, those lines are all equal to your standard 2 to 4 piece bonuses on gear. And then for two-handed weapons, we have the same thing here with the heavy weapons passive. They're now worth 2 of your typical set bonuses. So mauls have 2974 offensive penetration and swords have 258 weapon and spell damage. Then the follow-up passive was changed to now increase your damage done with all two-handed attacks by 10% for 4 seconds after completing a fully charged heavy attack, rather than increasing the damage of your next direct damage by 10% after completing a fully charged heavy attack. So this could be interesting for some PvP burst with two-hander skills, as well as some of the more off-meta PvE setups that are enjoying two-hander heavy attack builds. We did have a few gear set changes as well. So the Maelstrom two-hander Merciless Charge, this set now increases your damage done with direct attacks by up to a maximum of 560. So this is a flat damage boost. This isn't weapon and spell damage. This is 560 damage added to each direct damage attack. I did a breakdown video of this change as well if you want to dig a little deeper into that one. Sorc is doing incredible there with this Maelstrom two-hander due to the frequency of direct damage they have in their kits. But overall, I really like this change a lot here to the Maelstrom two-hander. It's a buff for a lot of setups using it, and it should be a very strong single target option for many classes and fights. Next up, we have Azureblight Reaper. This set's damage explosion can now only happen once every half second rather than having no cooldown. Targets will no longer become immune to stacks for 2 seconds after reaching the full stack count. Reduce the damage of the explosion by approximately 10%, but the damage now increases by 30% per enemy hit up to 180%. And then they also fixed an issue where this set could build up stacks with non-damage over time effects such as flurry or puncturing strikes. So I've seen a lot of discussion around this one. People are curious what's going on with it. It can no longer critically strike due to the way that it scales up. However, it does hit really hard when you have multiple enemies in range of it. Since it goes up to 180%, it does max out with its max tick values at 6 enemies present, but you still get more damage having more enemies around since it will be exploding on all of them. They have added in what is essentially a queue now with it, where it won't explode more than one at a time. It staggers them by 0.5 seconds each. So if you have multiple enemies at 20 stacks of this at the same time, essentially they have to wait in line to explode. But from early looks at this, it actually looks like it will be a buff for a lot of scenarios. And for really AoE heavy fights, it looks like it's going to be nice to have multiple people wearing this. We'll have to wait till the patch hits to see the exact numbers that are being pulled with it in dungeon and trial scenarios, but so far it's looking like it's going to be pretty juicy. So if you don't already have this set, it might be a good time to pick it up. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there are a ton of other small changes and bug fixes. I won't go through all of them, but I did want to cover a few of the changes that stood out to me. So sorry if I missed something relevant to an area of the game that you're really interested in. This would just be a 3-hour video or longer if I went through every one of these. So they did rework all Thieves Guild story and personal quests, so there's no longer a skill rank requirement. So this is nice, especially for newer players who just want to play through the story. You don't have to grind out Thieves Guild skills on the side to keep the story going now. And then for PvP, you'll only see your kill enemy player quest increment when you have contributed to a kill or dealt the killing blow. And coupled with that is the conquest board kill players quest. It's now group shared, and they said to counterbalance the rapid progress of this quest during certain PvP engagements, the number of kills required has been increased from 40 to 150. So it will be a bit tougher solo, it seems like, to get to that for sure, but I don't think this will be a big deal in a group. For the Witches Festival, they removed the need to use the Witch Mother's Whistle to get your XP bonus for this event. It will now be passive during the Witches Festival. So just log on to all your characters and it's automatically there. Does seem to imply that you won't be able to load up all your characters with these XP boosts right before the event is over and then carry them outside of the event anymore. They've added Arcanist related icons to the armory, so that's pretty cool. There will be a few more icons in there, it looks like. Then for help and tutorials, they added a new help entry to explain ability terminology between direct, overtime, single target, and area effects. And they updated almost all existing help entries on core combat mechanics such as roll dodge, block, and break free to extrapolate on their behaviors and use cases to better arm those who read them with vital knowledge. So I'm always down for some updated and better help info. And they also reduced the number of anchors required for Fighters Guild dailies from 3 to 1 and Somerset Geyser dailies from 3 to 1. So really nice quality of life change there for these. I almost never do these because it's just too annoying to run around and get 3 anchors. But 1 seems really reasonable to knock out and it shouldn't take too long at all. So that summarizes most of the big changes for update 39. Like I said, nothing too crazy, but definitely some new stuff to keep in mind with our builds and lots of little bug fixes and quality of life improvements, especially for a new player coming in. I'm looking forward to most of the changes. And it probably won't be long, maybe a month or so, I'm guessing, before we are looking at the PTS for update 40 and the new 2-player endless dungeons. So we did already get a sneak peek that we're getting some class sets for that, though we don't know any more info about those. So I'll make sure to keep you all up to date on the news for that as soon as we know more. Big shout out to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. The contributions help a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blakewin816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Vidridi, Florian, Phoenix, Nalandia, Unemployed, Chryseliana, Cha-Cha, Technical KO, Cap, and Danco77. Thanks again and see you later. Bye.